What if the man who saved an entire nation was nothing more than a liar? And what if that single lie was the only reason the country you know today was ever born at all? Let me tell you a secret I carried with me for the rest of my life. It is the winter of 1777, and an army is dying in the snow. 12,000 men marched into a frozen corner of Pennsylvania just weeks before, and now they are starving, freezing, and falling by the hundreds every single month, taken by fever, by sickness, and by a cold so brutal it kills men where they sleep. The soldiers who can still stand do not know how to march together. They cannot reload their muskets with any real speed, and the bayonets fixed to the ends of their weapons, the most terrifying tool a soldier can carry into battle. They use them for one thing, and one thing only. They use them to roast their beef over the open campfire. That is all these men believe a bayonet is good for. And just 18 miles away, the most disciplined fighting force on the entire planet sits inside a warm city, sleeping in soft beds and eating hot meals, content to wait for the winter to finish what their muskets had started. The dream of independence is about to die in the snow before it ever gets the chance to become a country. But here is what no one knew at the time. The man being sent to save that broken army was already aboard a ship, crossing the cold gray waters of the Atlantic. And almost everything written about him on paper was a lie. The rank was false. The title was inflated. The glorious reputation was a story stitched together by desperate men in a faraway city. I know all of this because that man was me. I was not who they believed I was. But what I knew how to do, that part was very, very real. But before I tell you how a lie saved a nation, let me welcome you back to this channel, where we bring the forgotten corners of history back to life. If you love true stories about the men and women who shaped the world, the ones the textbooks rushed past, then take a moment now to subscribe and turn on the bell, because stories like mine deserve to be remembered. Now, let me take you back to the very beginning. I was born on September 17th, 1730, inside the stone walls of a fortress town in the Kingdom of Prussia. My father was a military engineer, a serious man who built the things that won wars. I spent part of my childhood far away in the cold expanse of Russia, where my father served, before we returned home to German soil when I was just 10 years old. So you see, I was a man of many places before I ever became a man of war. I was schooled by Jesuit teachers, and I learned discipline the way other boys learned to play. By the age of 14, I stood beside my father as he directed engineers during the siege of a great city. By 17, I wore the uniform of a Prussian officer myself. And when the long and bloody war that consumed Europe finally erupted, I was thrown into the very heart of it. I was wounded in 2 separate battles. I served as an aide to powerful generals, and eventually I earned a place on the personal staff of the most feared military mind in all of Europe, and a seat in his elite school for officers. This was not a paper education. This was the real and brutal art of building an army, taught at the highest level that existed anywhere on Earth. And then, in an instant, it was all taken from me. When the war ended in 1763, the army shrank, and I was cast out. But there was more to it than that. Something I rarely spoke of. A rival, a jealous man working quietly in the shadows, had poisoned my name behind my back. And so a trained soldier, a man who had given everything, was suddenly left with nothing. What followed were more than 10 long years of quiet humiliation. I took a position managing the small court of a minor prince, a fancy title that came with almost no money at all. I traveled to borrow funds and failed. I knocked on the doors of Austria, of Baden, of France, and every single door closed in my face. Nobody wanted an old Prussian captain in a Europe that had grown tired of war. By the year 1777, I was 47 years old, nearly broke, and very nearly out of options. I had spent over a decade searching for someone, anyone, who needed what I knew how to do. And then everything changed in the city of Paris. I reconnected with an old acquaintance who happened to be the man in charge of France's entire war ministry. He knew the American colonies were fighting for their freedom against the British Crown, and he knew, better than anyone, that they needed professional help. He introduced me to 2 American diplomats stationed in the city. But that first meeting did not go well at all. These men had been buried under a mountain of unemployed European officers, all of them begging for high ranks and fat paychecks. And the American Congress had grown deeply suspicious of foreigners arriving with grand promises stuffed in their luggage. One of the diplomats sat there looking bored, then cut the meeting short and told me there was simply no job to give. That should have been the end of my story. But the French government had other ideas. They saw the value of a Prussian-trained mind, and they convinced the Americans to reconsider. So they wrote a letter of recommendation for me to carry across the ocean. And inside that letter, they told a lie. They described me as a lieutenant general who had served at the right hand of the Prussian king. The truth is, I had left that army as nothing more than a captain. One historian would later call it the greatest public deception ever carried out for a good cause. I did not write those words myself. But I confess to you now, I went along with every one of them. And to seal the deal, I made an offer no one could refuse. I asked for no salary at all. I would serve for free and be paid only if America won her war. And so, in September of 1777, I boarded a frigate and set sail for a land I had never seen, carrying a lie in my luggage and very little else. I brought with me a few French aides to translate, a young military secretary, and one more companion who never left my side, my Italian greyhound, a small dog who had followed me across half of Europe and now would follow me across an ocean. When we finally landed on American shores, our arrival nearly ended in disaster. My entire party stepped off the ship dressed in bright red coats, and the locals took one look at us and assumed we were British soldiers come to attack them. We were very nearly arrested before we could even explain ourselves. But once the confusion was cleared, word of the supposed Prussian general spread fast, and oh, how it spread. In one city after another, important men opened their homes to me. They hosted dinners in my honor. They spoke with me about politics and war. They saw a large, imposing man with a gleaming silver star pinned to his chest, etched with a single word that meant faithfulness. I looked like a general. I spoke like a general, and I moved through their gatherings with the quiet confidence of a man who had commanded thousands. Not one of them knew the truth. Then, on February 23, 1778, I finally rode into that frozen camp and reported for duty. The commander of the army rode out personally to meet me, and I want you to picture that moment the way I lived it. There he was, on horseback in the bitter Pennsylvania winter, moving through endless rows of crude log huts where his men huddled beneath thin and ragged blankets, many of them with no shoes at all, some wrapped in animal skins just to keep from freezing to death. And here I came, an enormous figure on a towering horse with oversized pistol holsters and that silver star catching the pale winter light. One of his soldiers later said I looked like the ancient god of war himself, brought to life and dropped into their camp. The commander was cautious, but he was curious, and within 2 weeks he made me the acting inspector general and asked me to examine the true condition of his entire army. What I found horrified me to the core. I will tell you plainly what I wrote at the time. Our weapons were in a horrible state, covered in rust, and our men were, in the most literal sense of the word, almost naked. But it was so much worse than that. The latrines had been dug at random, some of them placed right beside the kitchens where the food was prepared. Dead horses lay rotting out in the open. There was no standard way to march, no consistent way to fire or reload. Every regiment did things its own way, depending on where the men had come from. Some soldiers did not even know how to form a proper line, and the bayonets, those precious blades, the men had never once used them as weapons. They had no faith in them, and they used them for nothing but roasting their dinner over the fire. The British won their battles by charging with cold steel, and every time they did, these men broke and ran, every single time. But here is the turn that no one expected. Because while my rank was a lie and my title was a lie, the knowledge inside my head was absolutely real. My years in the Prussian army, my time on the staff of a legendary king, my education in that elite school for officers, none of that was invented. I may not have been a lieutenant general, but I was a master of the one thing this army needed most. And I went to work that very same day. I asked for 100 of the fittest men they could spare, drawn from across every regiment, and I added 50 more from the commander's own elite guard. But here is something most people never learned. Even 150 men was too many to begin with. So I chose just 20 of them to drill while all the others stood and watched and learned by their example. And then I did something no general in Europe would ever lower himself to do. I did not hand my instructions to junior officers and walk away. I stood in the freezing mud myself, before the sun even rose, in my full-dress uniform, and I trained those men with my own 2 hands. I adjusted their grips, I corrected their posture, I taught them to march at 75 steps a minute, and then at 120. I treated privates and corporals as if they mattered, because they did. But there was one obstacle that no amount of discipline could break through, and it ended up teaching me the greatest lesson of my entire life. The problem was simple. I could barely speak a word of English. I wrote every drill and every instruction in French, and each night my secretary, along with 2 of the commander's brightest young aides, would translate my words into English so the men could practice them by morning. And when things went wrong on that training field, when a soldier fumbled his musket or ignored my command, I would erupt. I cursed them in German, then I cursed them in French, and when I ran out of words, I would turn to my aide and shout at him to come and swear at these men for me in English because they simply would not do what I asked. And do you know what happened? The men loved it. They roared with laughter. And somehow that laughter did something my anger never could. It built trust. It turned a demoralized crowd of strangers into something that felt like a team. Eventually, I learned enough English to curse all on my own, and my booming voice rolling across that field became one of the most familiar sounds in the entire camp. But pay close attention now, because this next part explains everything. I discovered something about the American soldier that no European officer would ever have understood. In Europe, you say to your soldier, do this, and he does it. He never asks why. But here, I was forced to say to the American, this is the reason why you ought to do this, and only then would he obey. At first, this frustrated me to no end. It felt like a waste of precious time. But slowly, a far greater truth revealed itself to me. These men were not fighting for gold like the hired soldiers of Europe. They were not bowing to a king they feared. They were free citizens fighting for an idea. And the very same spirit that made them ask me why was the spirit that had built this entire rebellion. These were the people who had asked why they should pay a tax on tea they never ordered, and then threw that tea into the harbor. These were the people who asked why they should obey a king they had never met, in a land they had never seen. That single question, that stubborn and beautiful word, why, was the very thing that gave birth to this new nation. And so I stopped fighting it. Instead of building an army that ran on fear, I built one that ran on understanding. A Prussian, raised in the most rigid kingdom on earth, had somehow become the first man to truly grasp the democratic soul of the American fighting man. And the results came faster than anyone dared to hope. I did not just train those first men and walk away. I trained them to become trainers themselves, sending them back to their own regiments to teach everyone else. Like a chain reaction of skill spreading outward through the whole army. Within 2 months, soldiers who had barely known which end of the musket to point at the enemy were now marching in tight formation, reloading with speed and charging with bayonets that would have made a Prussian drill master proud. And I did more than teach them to fight. I moved those latrines far downhill and away from the kitchens. I set firm standards for cleanliness that cut disease dramatically. And in doing all of this, I built something that did not exist before, the backbone of the American Army. Its core of sergeants and officers who would carry this knowledge forward long after I was gone. Then came the true test. On a brutally hot day in late June of 1778, the Army marched out and met the British in the open fields of New Jersey. The temperature climbed near 100 degrees, so punishing that the heat itself struck down nearly as many men as the bullets did. One soldier said it felt like fighting inside the mouth of a burning oven. When one general foolishly ordered a retreat, the commander himself rode forward through the chaos, rallied his men, and ordered them to stand and fight. And for the first time in the entire war, they did. When the British charged with their bayonets, the very thing that had shattered these men in every battle before, they did not break, and they did not run. They charged right back. And amid that inferno, a soldier's wife carried water to the parched men, and when her husband collapsed beside his cannon, she took his place and worked that gun herself, even as an enemy shot tore away part of her clothing. She never left her post. A year later, in a daring midnight raid, these same trained soldiers stormed a British fort with unloaded muskets, taking it entirely with the bayonet, the very weapon they had once used only to cook their supper. That winter, I sat down and wrote the book that would outlive me by generations. It was a manual of regulations for the order and discipline of the troops of the United States, the first standardized training book the American Army ever had. With the help of those same brilliant young aides, I shaped it page by page, and Congress approved it and sent copies to every company and every officer in the Army. It remained the official manual of the United States military until the year 1814, and its influence stretched on for decades after that. Think on that for a moment. A man with a false rank had written the real rule book for an entire nation's army. And I was not finished yet. I sat in judgment at the trial of a captured British spy. I traveled south to help organize troops and supplies, though I will admit the hard fighting of the field was never my greatest gift. And then, in the autumn of 1781, I returned for the final act, commanding one of 3 divisions during the Great Siege that finally brought the British Army to its knees. When their commander surrendered roughly 8,000 men, the soldiers who dug those trenches and held those lines were fighting with the very discipline I had hammered into them in the snow 3 years before. When the guns at last fell silent, I helped send those weary men home with dignity, and I sketched out a plan for the nation's defense that planted the seeds for the great military academies that still stand today. In 1784, by a special act of Congress, the old Prussian with the forged resume became at last an American citizen. But I will be honest with you about how my story ends, because it is not the triumphant finale you might expect. The man who had trained an entire army spent his final years struggling with money. I had gambled everything on serving without pay, trusting that a grateful nation would provide for me when the war was won. And it did, eventually, but slowly, and I was never very good at holding on to what little came my way. In the end, I retired to a quiet and simple farmhouse in the countryside of New York. I never married. I had no children of my own. So I left what I had to 2 young aides I had come to love as sons. And when I died in the late autumn of 1794 at the age of 64, I was laid to rest in a quiet grove on my own land, far from the noise of the war that had defined me. But listen closely, because this is the part that truly matters. Today, my statue stands on that famous field where it all began, and another stands in a park directly across from the home of the American president. Counties bear my name. A city carries it too. And every September, people still march in parades to honor the foreigner who crossed an ocean to fight for a country that was not his own. Yes, my credentials were fake. My rank was invented. My closeness to a great king was wildly exaggerated. But the skills were real. The knowledge was real. And the transformation I brought was undeniable, proven on one battlefield after another after another. I took an army that did not even know how to hold a bayonet, and I turned them into men who could win a fight with nothing else. I built the system that still echoes in every drill sergeant's voice to this very day. I was, without question, a liar. But I was also the most important military teacher this nation has ever known, and the country I helped create could never have won its freedom without me. So perhaps the lesson is this. Sometimes the right person for the job is the one who has to tell a lie just to get through the door. But what keeps him in history forever is everything he does once he is inside, when the work, at last, is real. So now I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments below about the biggest lie you have ever heard of, that somehow turned out for the good of everyone. I would love to know your story. And if you felt something stir in you today, if you learned something you never knew before, then take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so that more people can discover the forgotten stories that deserve to be remembered. Thank you for spending this time with me. And until the next story, take care of yourself.